Sangye Jodan Soki Shonam La Shenjo Bardu Dani Kepsuchi Dagi Jinso Jipa Sonamgi Drola Penjer Sanga Drubar Show Drola Penjer Sanga Drubar Show Drola Penjer Sanga Drubar Show Something Tawatan they were good. Dungang Dungangi Yudan Dawaguchi Dungan Mewa Dewatan Mitra Wakuchi Nyanjan. May all beings be happy, may all beings be free from suffering, may all beings rest in joy beyond disintegration, and may all beings dwell in equanimity, which is with inner peace undisturbed by the comings of goings of pleasant and unpleasant beings. So anyway, thank you all very much for coming. I expect you all to be fully enlightened by the end of this weekend. I'm not sure if they gave a full money back guarantee, because one thing is once you become enlightened, you have many tricks up your sleeve to try and demonstrate that you're not enlightened, to get your money back. So you have to come to me and prove you're not enlightened. They say only one enlightened being can tell another. There's a whole bunch of enlightened beings called Nyumpe Naljar, crazy yogis. They try to pretend they're not enlightened. It was like that in India. The great Indian Mahasiddhas were part of that tradition. And in Tibet, it became very popular from earliest of days, because Tibetan Buddhism is basically Triyana, or three-vehicle Buddhism, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana combined. So from ancient times, being a crazy yogi was, someone said, "You're crazy," you say, "Oh, thank you." If they said, "That's crazy," they think, that might be a compliment, but I'm not sure. So many Tibetan masters signed their books crazy yogi, or crazy drunken yogi, or crazy beggar, or those kind of words. And I think that tradition also continued beyond India and beyond Tibet, went with Mahayana Buddhism wherever it traveled, was quite big in Mongolia, and because I spent some years in Mongolia and became involved with some of the traditions of Mongolian craziness. Therefore that became part of my storytelling legacy. So various people requested that this time on my visit to Chicago and to the TS to do something on the tradition of Powa. Powa in Tibetan literally means blast off. But often it's Powa literally means like jumping from one place to another, like a big jump or a big elevation. And the idea is that the moment of our death is a very flexible, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, time. That we can do a great transformation at that time. Our state of consciousness is in a very plastic, if you will, state, able to be molded and shaped and thrown in various ways. Tibetan name for Powa, not a name, but a kind of a epithet, I guess, is Magom Sangye, which means enlightenment without meditation. That's probably good in America, where everyone's very busy, and finding 12 hours a day for meditation around your busy work day and kids and paying the bills is tough. So you can do Powa and just do like 4 hours of meditation a day. In Buddhism, they don't call that meditation. They call that just like being lazy in a respectable physical posture. If you like stretch out on the TV with your legs up, chewing popcorn and drinking beer, your wife or husband can call you a lazy lout, or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, or the dog can bark at you, woof, lazy, woof, lout. But if you sit in meditation for those 4 hours without the TV on and without sloshing beer and eating popcorn, it looks very respectable. So it's not meditating in that way. You're sitting respectably. The real issue of Powa, as I'm teaching it this way, is based on highest yoga tantra, which means based on Kundalini or Chandali practice, based on Tummo practice. Otherwise, there's numerous other forms of Powa from the Sutra side. In Lojong, the Powa, the 5-point way of setting your mind at the time of death. And the Amitabha tradition of invoking Amitabha Buddha is a kind of a symbol of dying within the sphere of the radiant mind. Then there's sort of crossover Sutra and Tantra methods that are used in the Kriya Tantras and the Charya Tantras, the so-called lower Tantras, which utilize Amitabha and Maitreya Buddha and various, those are kind of just code names for practices. In the highest Yoga Tantra, every highest Yoga Tantra has its own Powa tradition. So I decided on this weekend to concentrate on two main legacies. The Powa as taught by Naropa in the 6 Yogas of Naropa, and the Powa as taught by the female mystic Niguma, perhaps sister, perhaps consort of Naropa, who also transmitted 6 yogas, but in a slightly, coming to Tibet in a different line and being preserved in a different line. And this second line of Powa comes through a set of Tibetan masters known as Shangpa Nobu Dun, the 7 jewels of the Shang kingdom, the great masters from Shang. One of them was Tongteng Gyalpo, who was a doctor, a Renaissance man, an engineer, but more importantly, a great practitioner who achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. So the Nuguma yogas come through him. Another system of Powa coming through him is the Shenrezi, or Buddha of Compassion practice. So for this weekend, we're going to combine a little bit from his Buddha of Compassion lineage with his Niguma lineage. And both of those come from through the Naropa, so they'll also combine them with the 6 yogas that Naropa transmitted to Marpa and came to Milarepa and so forth over the generations. So that's the basic plan. And we made a handout for people, which is 9 pages long. And I wanted it to be 10, but I ran out of things to say. And in that we have 3 things basically. First is the sadhana of Shenrezi that we'll use. Usually before doing a Powa practice, you do a generation stage mandala practice with mantra. So this one uses the most famous Tibetan mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. And this leads into a kind of a fusion lineage between the Kriya Tantras and the highest Yoga Tantras with Powa and Bardo Yoga and so on. And the second part of the handout has the Guru Yoga practice done in the Niguma as a preliminary to the 6 yogas of Niguma. And the third part of it just sort of outlines in a kind of a basic way how the Niguma Powa goes. So I won't give that to people tonight because some other people are coming tomorrow, and then it'll feel like I'm only giving out like 1 or 2 when I give out those tomorrow. And tonight it'll be like giving out too many, and tomorrow too few. Because of my Buddhist vow of equanimity, I'll give it out tomorrow morning. I thought tonight we want to look at a couple of little texts on the basic context of the practice. I wanted to read a poem by the 7th Dalai Lama, which he wrote for one of his disciples called Preparing the Mind for Death. It was used by one of my own teachers, Gelek Rinpoche, who passed away 2 years ago, as a part of a book he did called Happy Life, Happy Death, or something like that. Whenever I mention titles of his books in crowds where there are students, I always correct the title. They don't know this kind of Asian etiquette that if your teacher makes a mistake, you're supposed to repeat the same mistake. That makes it difficult learning language in the East, because when you're talking to someone, if you say it in a wrong way, they repeat it in the wrong way. And then you become more confident that you're saying it in the right way. And this happens 1,000 times. And finally you meet like a rude Asian, and they correct you. Then you have to argue with them because you use this 1,000 times in front of other not rude Asians. And they've all gone along with the way you were saying it quite nicely and even repeated it. Yeah. Anyway, it might be called Happy Life, Happy Death. But the idea with Powa is that if we live a happy life, by the sort of Buddhist definition of happiness, I guess, happiness is defined as something that is the product of positive thinking, positive speaking, and positive activity. It's sort of these 3 streams flow together into a river that make our life strong and happy and joyful. And if that's the case, then at death it becomes quite easy to have a happy death. Powa as Magam Sangye, enlightened Buddhahood without meditation, really refers to this kind of happy life, happy death, living a positive life in all 3 levels of body, speech, mind, you could say. Doing daily meditation where we become aware of our mental fluctuations and the driving forces of our mind. Becoming more deeply self-aware. Doing what Tibetans call lojong, which is mind training. Lojong training perhaps also could be, Buddha once said, used the expression, in Tibetan translation, as semdulwa, which means semdulwa literally means taming the mind, but really means inner peace. Inner peace in the Buddhist world is something which is the result of a kind of a spiritual cultivation and inner cultivation. By watching our karmic flows. Karmic here just means energy flows, activities. Those of you who came to the Thursday talk, this word karma came up a little bit. Some people said they didn't like karma, others said they liked karma, others said they didn't care about karma. It's like that thing, like that with most things, isn't it? Some people like it, some don't like it, some don't care. Karma in Buddhist world just means work or doing something. Whenever you do something, your energies shift. Your whole life energy shifts. When I was teaching out in California 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk in the Ojai Retreat Center on the 3 Buddhist qualities of compassion, wisdom, and power as healing forces. And at the end of it, someone, a lady who obviously struggled with feeling compassion and happy at the same time, asked the question of how one can be compassionate without feeling depressed. Because when we think of the suffering in the world, there's so much of it everywhere that it can become depressing. Actually, in the Buddhist world, we think that if you first establish the basic mind of joy, then compassion is not a heavy experience. It's rather a joyful experience in that you're sharing something very deep and very personal with someone. It's a very intimate experience. So in karma, when we do things, everything we do shifts things a little bit. So I ended my reply to her question by mentioning that every time we do something, we shift the whole universe balance. That the universe is basically a work in progress. It's always changing. And one thing can kind of be the straw, a very small thing can be the straw that broke the camel's back, or taking a straw off of the suffering of that suffering camel can be the straw that saves the camel's life. And then of course that camel disappearing for the rest of its life because it died changes many things for the rest of the universe. And by it living for however many more years a camel is likely to live. Probably depends on whether he lives in a camel meat-eating country or a vegan country. But however much longer he lives or she lives, that impact continues. And everyone ever benefited by that camel or suffered because of the lack of that camel coming into their life is accordingly affected. Karma simply means the power of, Eckhart Tolle, how did he put it? The power of now. Karma has the sense in Buddhism of le. The word for work in Tibetan is just le. Le meaning karma with a ka after it. The ka just means it's something you're being paid to do or which you consider a part of your career or something like that. But otherwise, just without the ka, le means doing, exercising some aggression, I guess is the word, with your body, speech, mind. interfering with the whole universe to some extent is a karma. And every time you interfere with it, you change it somehow. And a positive interference creates a positive reverberation, and that reverberation reverberates again and again and again and again, becoming, of course, more diversified in each generation of its reverberation. And if that's positive, then that goes on in a eternity equation. If it's negative, similarly, it has some kind of long-lasting impact on this universe in which we live. So Powa as happy life means to train one's mind, blast up or lift up one's mind in a spiritual way, but also to increase the radiance and clarity of the mind. And as a yogic practice, during life it means a kind of a death rehearsal, you could say. As a sutra practice, it's definitely a death rehearsal. Learning how to, at the time of one's death, making sort of mental preparations. For instance, in high school and college, I was a boxer. I like to mention that, because many people think boxing is not Buddhist, but they both begin with B. And before you step into the ring, and I was only a very low-level amateur boxer, I wasn't like, I just visited with the publisher of my first book in America from Snowline. He was New York Golden Gloves, and as a professional went 19-0. 0 losses in 19 fights, and in his 20th fight lost, so he thought, I think I'll change my profession. So dying rehearsal, before you step into the ring with a boxing match, it doesn't matter who you are, who you're going up against, you kind of rehearse in your mind how you're going to sit in your corner and how you're going to stand up and how you're going to hold your hands as well as you walk out, and you sort of come up with your idea of doing it. So in the Sutra, the open teachings of Buddha and Kriya, or the first level Tantra, it's a little bit like that, a death rehearsal, you could say. And many people do that using the Sutra methods of Amitabha Buddha or Maitreya Buddha and so forth. And sometimes, if they like those methods a lot, they will later unite them with highest yoga Tantra practices, such as from the 6 yogas, the various 6 yogas traditions. And I was just in Pittsburgh staying with a friend who every day does a Powa practice from the Drikung Kagyu tradition, known as the blade of grass. Sort of pulling the consciousness out of the body, like pulling up a blade of grass. Doing so has, even though this may not, on various levels, and if you become stable in this, you can combine it with highest yoga, Kundalini, or Chandali practices, the higher yoga energy practices. And I didn't discuss with him whether or not he did that, but that option is there. But doing a Powa practice daily, at the very least, has the great benefit of reminding us of our own mortality. And Buddha said that of all footprints in the forest, that of the elephant is greatest, and of all basic mindfulness and meditations, mindfulness of one's mortality is the most impactful, has the greatest impact. remembering every day the limits of our life and our immortality immediately causes us to become a more thoughtful, patient, gentle person with certainly reduces our tendency to anger and desire, attachments and frivolities. And when we combine that with other spiritual practices, becomes a very powerful method. Therefore, in early days in India, Buddhist monks, or I don't know if we can really call them monks. I think the Buddhist monk tradition developed later, but in the early days, the Buddhist homeless practitioners, the ones who went from home to homeless, would often live in charnel grounds for a month or two. And a charnel ground, a place at the edge of the forest where bodies were left to be eaten by the wild as offerings to the wild animals. And they would sit sort of observing the various state of decomposition of the corpses and so on, and thinking, soon I'll be here. I can't remember who wrote it on their gravestone, but I was recently came up on something. I was looking through a sort of great gravestone statements, where some guy on his gravestone wrote something along the lines of, "Thanks for visiting me here. Please keep in mind, you're on your way." I think that's a kind of a very useful thing to remember. So even if we get no other benefit from Powa, if we don't get the benefits of actually opening the death channel, or preparing a Vajra body, as it's sometimes called in Tantric Buddhism, even if we don't accomplish that great feat, but get no other benefit, merely sitting and remembering that we have limited hours, days, weeks, months, and years. And doing that on a regular basis inspires us to lead deeper, more meaningful, more personal lives, more human lives. Otherwise, I think much of the negativity that's done in the world is done in the lapse of such awareness. It's done when that being our reality temporarily drifts from our attention. If someone shouted something at you very insulting and you were about to shout, you got really irritated and were about to shout back, and someone in the corner suddenly pointed a machine gun at you, or no, let's not go for a machine gun, let's go for a sawed-off shotgun where you go and you look and it's pointed at you, and he or she is probably would be a she with a sawed-off shotgun. Not really, no. Your anger at that other person would completely fade away. It would be eclipsed by a whole other awareness. So meditating or contemplating or remembering one's mortality once a day at least in Buddhism is thought to be a surefire recipe to a happy life. As a traveling Dharma teacher, I often have people approaching me who have lost relatives and lost friends, parents who have lost children, and young people who have lost parents dying early, and so on and so forth, brothers and sisters. And very often there's a deep sense of both shock, almost like trauma, and almost disbelief, like how could that happen? But when we contemplate the nature of life once a day, that trauma is not part of the present of our reality, not part of the factors in our life. When we understand all the basic statement by the Buddha that all things made of parts that come together one day fall apart. Driving around Chicago looking at all the rusty cars, this becomes quite obvious the case. So some people think, well, it's a little bit kind of morbid to think about death and dying and that aspect of life. It's better just to live a full, complete life as much as you can. And there is some merit to that way of thinking. The problem is if we don't remember our mortality on a regular basis, we rarely live a full and a dynamic life. We much more often will just kill time here and kill time there and veg out here and veg out there and basically waste a lot of time. Dalai Lama once said in one of his teachings, some people cherish money and some cherish power and some cherish possessions and so forth. But when it comes right down to it, the thing we have that is the most precious are the moments of our life. And until we develop a mind that really cherishes our moments as our most valuable possession, we will be losing some of the preciousness that is here in our lifespan. So in the Buddhist world, we think there's also a good side to the impermanent nature of things. If things weren't impermanent, then the whole world would be filled with, like, we'd be walking 100 miles deep over like other living beings. There's this idea that we have one form and one test, and then another form and another test, and another form and another test. Or one form and one job, and another form and another job, another form and another job. In a way, it's a much happier situation than being stuck as the one identity in the one life. That this idea that in this lifetime we can accomplish great things, but if we don't accomplish the ultimate samyak sambodhi, as is known in Sanskrit, ultimate liberation or nirvana or the non-residing nirvana of 11th level bodhisattva, meaning a Buddha, fully enlightened being, then it's kind of nice to be able to step out of being me who gets stuck in so many of my own bad habits and same old friends all the time and same language, English, and maybe a little bit of Tibetan and some French, throw in a bit of Spanish, gracias, arrivederci. But if we don't accomplish the ultimate at this life, then next life we get to hop out and have a whole new kind of working environment. It's kind of a happy thought in its own way. And for those who don't like the idea of reincarnation, they think, I just die and go, then big deal. If you just disappear when you die, I mean, there's also, as well as the good things in life, there's the difficult things. Every time you eat, you have to go to the bathroom. And every morning, you have to get out of bed. And every evening, you have to go to bed. And there's kind of a 50-50 life in terms of pleasure and pain, or not really pain, I guess, but like easy, having really easy going, flowing things, and things were a little bit on the harsh side. Like winter in Chicago is too cold, and the summer in Chicago is too hot, and spring in Chicago is too muddy, and autumn in Chicago there's too many mosquitoes. Other than those four things, Chicago is a great place to be. Or if you live in the West Indies, it's like very nice for a couple of weeks, and then a hurricane may be passing over you, so everyone nails up their houses and runs and hides, and 2 minutes before it hits your island, it swings south and wipes out the inhabitants of that island. Or you're in Hawaii, which is a hurricane-ridden mosquito swamp, and it has many good days, and the hurricanes don't come, and the mosquitoes are a little bit more relaxed. But if you don't have a feel for reincarnation, then I think one's life is no happier or no less happy based on that confidence. I think it's whether or not one believes in reincarnation. I think if one meditates and develops one's mind, one can still lead a 51% happy life and only 49% difficult one. Yeah, I think it really, with most people, gets up to 95 and 0-5. But most people, the 0-5% of suffering is more memorable than the 95% of pleasure. So anyway, to meditate once a day on one's mortality is considered important, and with Powa practice, one does that through rehearsing one's death, rehearsing it in a meditative way and a yogic way. When I say belief in reincarnation, I think people can believe it or not believe it if they have if they lack certain qualities. But if you meditate deeply and achieve samadhi and you remember your previous lives, I'm not sure that would be believing in previous lives anymore. Would it, you think? If you remember your previous lives, is believing in reincarnation a belief, or is it a knowledge of fact? So in the Buddhist world, we say you can do either in the waking state through samadhi or in dream state through dream yoga. You can develop a clairvoyant quality, able to remember your previous lives, and perhaps even to read some of the previous lives of those beings who are close with you, with whom you have karmic affinity. And of course, some of the great treatises on logic, like Plato and Socrates, and like Dharmakirti from India, present what they think of as infallible logic. But if your mind isn't good at math, it's probably not good at logic, in which case the best presented logical argument will not necessarily be convincing. So then it's said that the idea of reincarnation remains a belief. Without the idea of reincarnation, I think, the practice of Powa is equally beneficial. that merely people keeping a mind, an eye regularly on their mortality is a great asset in grounding them in the realities of life as a humanoid on our little green planet. Many of the Powa texts in Tibetan and Powa traditions have a practice called observing for the signs of death. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for instance, when I was speaking on Thursday, I mentioned some of those. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is a collection of, I think it's 6 books, all of which are called liberations. And on Thursday I mentioned 2 of them, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and by seeing a poster you hang over your door, and so whenever you walk, Tibetans had very low doors, so you'd always have to look up when you walked in the door so as not to bump your head. And so you'd always see the mantra of liberation, and by seeing it would bring liberation. And they had various others, like by tasting, you make a kind of a nectar with sacred substances, and taking a drop of that each day kind of refreshes you. And one is called, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead system of having those 6, one is called liberation by means of knowing, watching for the signs of death. I included a chapter of those in my book, Living in the Face of Death. I'd been asked to translate that. When I lived in Dharamsala, we couldn't have a normal kind of income, and I didn't have a great wealthy patron, so I would support myself for the 12 or 15 years of my training by helping with little academic projects here and there. One of them was translating that. I was interested in it simply because I had very much loved the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a read, Liberation by Hearing in the Bardo. And so I thought it'd be interesting to read the way these signs are sort of described. They are a little bit mysterious, and so if you read through them, you think, oh my goodness, I think I've had all those kind of dreams before, and I've seen clouds looking like that, and I've heard those kind of birds coming from those directions. So people aren't supposed to look at them in ordinary times. You do what's in Tibetan is called a sok, like a tantric feast where you have you basically do a long chanting mantra piece. And then you offer meat and alcohol and eat some biscuits and things, and then go to bed and watch your dreams. So even like vegetarians and people who don't have a vow against touching alcohol, they replace the meat with yogurt and the alcohol with tea. And they go to bed, but after doing this 3-hour ritual, you're kind of hyped up. And so you have much clearer dreams than otherwise. When those of you who have attended my teachings on the 6 yogas of systems of Naropa and Niguma, the 2 ways to practice dream yoga, one is to have a strong intention at the time of going to sleep to dream clear dreams and to remember your dreams. And the other is more sophisticated. It's having the power of Chandali or Kundalini yoga, so that when you enter dreams, you put the energies in the 5 or 7 chakras in the right proportion in the various chakras that fine-tune your dream state. So it's easier to do it by means of intention, although those dreams are not as I told you shouldn't be putting vodka in your glass. For those of you watching, it was just tea. But I mentioned if you don't drink alcohol, you can replace it with tea. That's why she started coughing. What was about tea? Anyway, with the power of intention, one gets those dreams. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, appendix, would you call it? I'm not sure. Anyway, part of that compendium of self-liberations by doing something. There's signs in dreams and signs of the body and speech and mind and nature and all those kind of things. So a lot of Tibetan meditators and yogis, and I think Tibetans although they're a very sophisticated people, when we think of people like Dalai Lama and Ling Rinpoche and any great lamas we've met, that they have a very kind of modern sophistication about them, or a sophistication that integrates well into the modern way of moving and thinking and behaving. But at the same time, they have this very ancient sensitivity, I think, connected to the shamanic world of earlier days of human life, when I would say life was less human dominated, less conceptually constructed, if you will. And people lived closer to nature, closer to animals, and closer to weather, and closer to the dream state. So they take those signs very clearly, and they say, if you do that practice once a year, you'll be able to tell if there's any threats to your life in the next weeks, days, months, and so on. So some of them do it once a month, and some of them do it once a year, some of them do it every 12 years, because it said a good yogi or meditator will know the dangers to his or her life up to 14 years before it occurs. So you'll have dream signs or nature signs or omens or whatever one would want to call them. And some people think, well, that's a little bit scary. It's kind of nice to have a surprise. You're just sort of walking down the street. Danny, you go to see the movie Vice? Mm-hmm. Yes? Wasn't it very cute, the way the guy who donated his heart to Cheney? Yeah. His role in that movie came to an instant end. So some people think it would be nice to die like that, completely unexpected in your sleep, or, trip over your dog, fall downstairs and hit your head on the banister on the way down or something. But in the Buddhist world, the advanced meditators think it's very nice to sort of pace yourself. Like going to an opera, there's sort of a time when it begins, there's a time for the coffee break in the middle, and there's a time when it ends and everyone walks out. So they do the yoga for the signs of death. That was the first time I saw it. And the next time I came across it was a few years later, when I was received the lineage of Amitayus Hayagriva combined, of the healing yogas of Milarepa, as they're called in Tibetan. And that text by the first Dalai Lama comes with a similar chapter on learning to read the signs of your death. And in it, prior to that, he mentions that when you do the signs, when you do that reading of the omens, or divination, I guess a kind of divination, you call it, when you do that, if your 3 threads supporting your life are all strong, you'll know you're safe for a good long time in the future. If one of the 3 is damaged, then there'll be some susceptibility, and it's good to do the longevity yogas. If 2 of the 3 threads supporting your life
are damaged, then you should go and retreat and do like a very intense 2 or 3 month retreat. And I remember some years ago that happened when I was in Dharamsala with Dalai Lama. His own meditations indicated from doing that reading for signs of death. And based on the first Dalai Lama's lineage, sort of had him concerned, and so the state oracle did a trance, and then they had the Gadong oracle do a trance, and other high lamas did divinations, and they all put him into retreat for 6 months. And on account of that, today at 84, he still travels and teaches 10 months of the year. And so and then it goes on, the first dilemma goes on to say, if all indications, if indications reveal that there's damage to all 3 threads, then you should understand no point in bothering with the longevity yogas and train quickly in the Powa. Then he dedicates the next chapter to talking about the various Powa traditions. But he doesn't go into them in precision, for this is how you do each one, and so on and so forth. He just kind of lists them and talks about them in a general way. So I thought for this little bit here, I'll just read a few of his comments. It says, it's best if one can enter the training in Powa at least 6 months before your death. In other words, doing the Powa every day for 6 months has a very deep impact on how the energies in the body move. And as is said in Tantra, mind rides on the subtle energies like a rider on a horse. So he gives 6 months as the time period. Other texts I've seen say it's good to learn the Powa, even when you're a teenager. Because as a teenager, you may think you have another 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 years left, but one never knows such things. And so having the body trained in that way and conditioned in that way is a good thing to do. So he just says 6 months. So he says, I'll discuss the Powa under 2 topics, the Sutrayana, that means the open teachings of Buddha, and Vajrayana, the Tantric tradition. So in general, we could say that all traditions of Buddhism have some kind of teaching for Powa, some kind of, I don't know if teaching is the right word, some kind of training tradition, perhaps, is a better word. So he says, various methods of preparing the mind for death have been taught in both the sutras and tantras. To die while meditating upon the profound emptiness nature is a method called transference by the thatness of being. In other words, meditating emptiness here means a kind of the infinite nature of our life, the infinite nature of our mind, something like that. In Tantra, they call it luminous emptiness. In Sutra, they just say emptiness, but the meaning is the ability to sit in complete stillness without any conceptual activity. And when one sits in complete stillness, and that stillness isn't like a forced stillness or a sleepy stillness, but rather a simple, open quietness without conceptual distortion. I thought to read a poem, just while I was saying that, I thought to read a poem that I'd marked that I thought I might read from the other night. Is it in this book? When death's moment falls, withdraw the mind from distortion, craving, and conceptualization. Avoid worldly hopes and fears. In other words, to bring the mind to a state of complete inner peace. But an inner peace, I would say, characterized by a kind of watchfulness. So as one passes away, whatever arises is seen with the wisdom of emptiness. In other words, it's seen as an appearing phenomena, not as an assaulting entity, not as an attractive or a repulsive entity, but simply seen with a kind of no pushing and no pulling, and not giving rise to conceptualized states, keeping the mind in the state of relaxed clarity or emptiness. So that's known as Powa, the Sutrayana Powa of Transcendence, Powa, by the thatness of being. So whenever I translate these things, I'm not as bad as the Canadian-German Herbert Gunther, who every book completely changed all the words all the English words he used for every Buddhist term. But it's always funny when I read my own writings from, say, the late 70s to the late 80s to the late 90s to the late 2000 to 2010s and the late 2000 teens. So there I use the word transcendence for Powa, which is a very silly word to use for it. I far prefer blast off. That was the original one I used back in the late 70s. And then people talked me out of it. They said, blast off sounds too rocket sciencey. But I still like blast off. So blasting off by me, where is it? Blasting off by the thatness of being, with the thatness of being. Thatness literally means seeing things openly, as the Seventh Lama puts it in that poem, without any hope or fear. Just observing it as a presence while resting totally quietly in the sort of the sense of the infinity of your soul or something like that. Thatness in Tibetan, de nyi. De is that, and nyi is itself, or nyi is essence, the very essence of that, the essence of being. In Sanskrit, it's often dharmata. So dharma is something, anything. It doesn't have to be a thing in the sense of a composite thing like a mountain or tree, or a truth or something like that. It can be, but anyway, anything that exists, but ta, which refers to a kind of quintessential nature. And I think sometimes in Tibetan Buddhism we see the expression rochikpa, which means one flavoredness or one tasteness. So training one's mind to be able to rest in the one flavoredness of being without hopes or fears and without conceptualization. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a tantric text, so it tends to use the terms quite common to the Madhyamaka and mind-only schools of Indian Buddhism, where you see all things as as a expression of your own mind or your own life. I don't know if mind is the right word, although it's called mind-only school. Jeffrey Hopkins, the great professor from Charlottesville, Virginia, who I would say was the first person in the West to really understand deeply the linguistic nature of those schools. So it's not that everything is in the nature of mind, but the mind and everything that we experience is Zechik, is of one substance. So if you say everything's of the nature of the mind, it sort of makes it seem like you're just projecting it, doesn't it? But when you say mind and all things are of one substance, it has a different implication. You could say everything is thingness, dharmata, the word, or thatness. So something like that. So another Sutrayana method is to meditate upon the conventional body-mind or altruistic thought of enlightenment while passing away. In other words, the bodhicitta. There are many varieties of this technique, a very important one being the Mahayana Lojong. So I mentioned that earlier. Then the first Lama said I wrote on that in one of my other texts, Training the Mind in the Great Way. So I translated that text and I published it in English, so I'm sure all of you bought 3 copies and have read it 3 times, so I don't have to elucidate that Mahayana technique of Powa. And he said, a method uniting both sutra and vajra is given in the tradition, the 3 essential points. What is that called? Nyingpo Dunsum in Tibetan, Nyingpo Dunsum. And so the second Dalai Lama wrote a commentary upon that. Here the first says he also did, but I'm not sure he did. He might be bragging and boasting that he wrote something that he didn't actually write. Or maybe I mistranslated the passage. And there it says, abandon all attachments, offer your body as a gift to living beings, unite with the reed of light and transfer consciousness to the Tushita. Again, I've written a small book on that. So the same thing as Duchak, attachments in English has a kind of a slightly different sense than in Tibetan. Dupa means you like it or you want it, and chakpa means you kind of, it gets stuck on the way through your mind and becomes something of like in Africa, some of the monkey hunters would put like a big ball in the forest, and inside they'd put some food, and the monkey would put its hand in to grab the food, but the food was too big to take out, and it could let it go and pull its hand out, but it would become too obsessed with getting that thing out of there that it wouldn't let go. Then the fellow would come along, I don't know what he would bring, a butterfly net or something, but he'd catch the monkey. Then he'd have a pet monkey, and he'd move to New York, and he'd buy a grinder, and he'd become a monkey grinder. Didn't they used to call them monkey grinders? They actually grinded the machine, not the monkey. Organ grinder, okay. But there's a monkey there, right? Yeah. Okay. So when a duchak has that kind of meaning in Tibetan, you grab hold of it and you can't let it go, and you get stuck on it, and you end up, you think you've won something, but it won you. You think you got it, but it got you. So abandon that. Offer your body as a gift to living beings. That's part of the tradition from the great female mystic Machi Glabden. The naked yogini, as she was sometimes called in Tibet, because from age 15, when she became a wandering meditator. She rarely wore any clothes. Meditated on Everest for many years, achieved enlightenment, and age 33 achieved enlightenment, and then moved near the old capital of Setang, lived in a cave and taught for the next 63 years until she passed away. But in that practice, she has a practice of a yogini practice where you transform, you imagine your body sitting there, and at your heart is a Vajrayogini. And Vajrayogini hops out of your body, and it's like she's just like the size of the thumb in the center of your heart chakra. And she sort of hops out in front and starts dancing. And she has a skull cup and the cutting knife, as many of the yoginis are pictured as having. The skull cup being the blood of life and the blood of great bliss, and the knife being the wisdom that penetrates to that great bliss. Anyway, then she goes whoosh, whoosh, and cuts off the top of your head. This is it's sort of done as a song, and you use a big drum, boom, 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 boom. It's called the Kusali offering in Tibetan. And then she cuts off the top of your head and holds it up and does a mantra, and at the center everything turns to great bliss. And then she takes her knife and goes and throws your whole body into it. And it all bubbles and boils and becomes healing nectar beneficial to all living beings. Then you throw some into the hell realms. She throws some into the hell realms. And all the hell beings are very happy to have this delicious nectar that brings, in the hot hells brings cool, and in the cold hells brings warmth, and throws in the ghost realms, and all the ghosts who normally have difficulty finding something digestible. They travel around with Tums and Rolaids all the time. But this nectar they can drink, and throws it into the animal worlds, and those suffering from heat and cold and from being eaten by other animals and so on. And when they eat it, their wisdom greatly increases, their compassion and their wisdom, and they're liberated from their states of suffering and take higher rebirth, and then throws it into the human realms. And although 99% of humans are very well behaved, there's 1% out there who are still violent and greedy and unpleasant. You agree with my statistics? They say 99% of statistics are made up on the spot. Do you think I just made that one up on the spot? And then throws it into the Asura realms, the fighting gods or the Titans. And they all become less jealous and less arrogant and whatnot, and less violent. And they put down their weapons and become peaceful, happy little Asuras. And then she throws it into the Devas, the god realms, the worldly god realms, where the Devas suffer from long lives of pleasure, but total apathy towards the whole universe around them. And so it cures them of their apathy. So that's known as the offering of the body. Unite with the reed of light and transfer consciousness. So then, while at the end of this practice, when one has completely given away one's body to all sentient beings, and just at that moment, one waits till one's last breath has come and one goes out and the clear light of the moment of death arises. Then one looks up and looks and sees a sort of a reed of light, or a river of light, or a pathway of light. And again, this is described in some near-death experiences, people seeing this kind of light, tunnel of light. Look up and just lean straight into it. And Powa transfer to Tushita. So I'm just reading what he wrote there. We're not going to do that practice this weekend. We could, but I forgot my skull cup. Although, didn't you buy one at a auction sale last year?
Yes,
Oh, you got the drum made of 2 skull cups, right? Yeah, well, we don't want to take those apart. You also need the knife, the dakini knife. Tomorrow we're going to do the one from combining the Shenrezi form with the 6 yogas form. Anyway, this system he mentions here, it's known as combining Sutra and Tantra because it brings together some of the elements of the Buddha's open teachings, or sutras are called Sutra, with Buddha's tantric teachings. So again, many Vajrayana masters preparing the mind for transcendence at death have been taught. To list but a few of these, a transference to the 3 kayas. And that's a part of the system of what Marpa called the 3 blendings, where one takes 3 aspects of one's being and blends them into the 3 kayas. Transference by means of instructions related to Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. So we're going to do something with those tomorrow. And then the Lamtrey methods of transference by means of the 4 initiations. One should train in whichever is most suitable to one's abilities, background, and mental propensities. I think mental propensities there means karmic propensities. In other words, some people are a little more yogic than others, and some people are a little more devotional than others. Some people are a little more intellectual than others. That's kind of personality traits or something like that manifested. No matter which one you use, one should receive the detailed instructions from a qualified teacher and gain proficiency in practice directly under his, I should have added, or her guidance. Tibet has no gender pronoun. So it's just Kong in Tibetan, meaning blobs. Blobs. Blob would work as a pronoun. Thingamajig. That's a good one. Thingamajig's instructions. O hark! Herein, in accord with the teachings of the Buddha, the commentaries of later Buddhist masters, and the oral instructions of my own teachers, is a treatise on the manifestations of how to read for the various signs indicating one's duration of lifespan, as well as 3 great methods for turning death away, premature death away, and also the method of transferring the mind at the time, consciousness transference. When approached with the Milarepa alchemy, yogas are an everlasting tree producing the fruit of both temporary and ultimate fulfillments. When approached with the freshness of wisdom combined with the spiritual curiosity, and therefore it's also written in order to benefit those with interest in knowing more about this sublime path. So that's sort of the way he concludes his treatise on the longevity yogas, as well as the Powa practice. So I think we'll stop there for today. I didn't want to start teaching the 6 yogas form until tomorrow because 3 or 4 people couldn't come in the evening because they work and have kids and all that sort of stuff. So tonight we had said, anyway, we said, well, I was just going to do an introduction. And so that's the introduction. Ha ha, ho ho, he he, hum hum hum. Or as they say in Tibet, Om Ahum. Thank you so much.